Sarah Martinez had learned to read weather in the way others read a book. The soft bruise of heat that came before a storm. The way the desert wind carried sand and secrets in the same breath. She knew Sakoro County's backroads the way some people know the lines of their own hands. Every rumble strip, every washboard patch, every house that had a porch light 2 minutes late. In the summer of 1996, she kept her rig smelling faintly of lemon cleaner and coffee and the memory of other people's panic. She had been a paramedic long enough that her hands could move in a kind of muscle memory prayer before the doctors even spoke. She had been a daughter long enough that prayers had sat in her throat like small pebbles, Catholic and habitual, never heavy enough to make her bend. If you stay with this story until the end, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications. There are moments here that matter to those who care for others, and the conversation we started with Sarah hasn't stopped. If it touches you, share it with a healer or a friend. Leave a comment about any inexplicable kindness or recovery you've seen. The night the lights came, she was on her way back from a minor car accident on County Road 7. The siren off now, the radio a soft static hum through the cab. It was a moon-sick night, the sky a hard indigo slate pierced with indifferent stars. Ahead, over a low mesa, two lights moved exactly like two eyes. Only they were too close together, too deliberate. They pulsed in a slow pattern that made the hair on her forearms lift. Sarah slowed, eased the rig onto the shoulder. Her partner had gone ahead with a flashlight. He called back a laughing, nervous thing. "Probably a deer," he said. The laugh was a thin bandage over his unease. Sarah stepped out, the night holding its breath. The wind smelled like dust and metal and cooling tar. As she walked toward the lights, she thought, not for the first time, about how small her hands looked in the cosmic ledger. An acknowledgement she carried quietly, like a credit balance she had not asked for. On the scrub near the mesa, she found something that did not belong. A figure, curled like a child around its own knees, half hidden beneath a blanket of cloth that shimmered faintly when the wind moved it. The being's skin was the color of moonlight on aluminum. Its face was a suggestion of features rather than a face, with large, dark eyes that held more curiosity than fear. When it saw Sarah, it did not bolt. Instead, it looked up with a kind of wary relief, and Sarah felt the first strange, hot tug of recognition, an ancient, practical compassion that had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with someone small and in pain. She knelt, and instinct took over. She checked for pulse, breathing, pupils. The being's chest rose but unevenly, like a frightened sleeper. No broken limbs, no puncture wounds. Its breathing smelled faintly of copper and something sweet, like overripe stone fruit. She called into the radio for a medevac classification, even as her fingers found a pulse that was too slow and too regular for panic, something older, something steadier underneath the surface. She wrapped the being gently, lifted it onto a borrowed stretcher, and, for reasons that had nothing to do with protocol, she tucked a thin, faded rosary, her mother's, into the strap beside its shoulder. The gesture was automatic, ancestral, habit braided with hope. The being's fingers brushed the beads, and its hand flexed around them with an odd tenderness, as though something in that small human-made chain matched a pattern in its own memory. At the clinic, they tripped all the circuits of suspicion and wonder. Dr. Stevens frowned at the intake form, then at the being, then at Sarah. "You found it on County Road 7?" he asked. He was a man who had seen bad things and called them by their names. Tonight, his voice trembled a degree his practiced face would not show. "It was hurt," Sarah said. Her voice had that specific flatness that professionals developed to keep their own fear calm. No obvious trauma, respiratory irregularities, need to run basic panels. She avoided saying the word alien aloud in that sterile room. Words can anchor or shatter. They ran tests, slow and methodical. They photographed and labeled. They called in a nurse with steady hands. Across the fluorescent glare, the being watched Sarah the way a child studies a parent in motion. It was when the being's temperature dipped that the evening bent toward impossibility. The monitor showed core temp dropping in microdegrees, enough to worry the team. The being closed its eyes, and for a moment the room smelled only of lemon cleaner and the copper of the IV. Sarah reached out, without thinking whether her training allowed it, and placed her hand over its chest. Her palm met a thin, quivering warmth that felt like a living pulse, concentrated and not wholly of blood. For a breath, one precise electric breath, she knew nothing of anatomy or protocol. She felt a pressure behind her ribs, like someone pressing a memory into her sternum. Then a thought, clear and not her own, landed between her ears like a voice returning a borrowed book. "Do not be afraid," it said. Not spoken aloud, but transmitted, an instruction with the soft cadence of someone who had watched humans from the margins for a very long time, and chosen these words because they fit the small anatomy of trust. The voice was threaded with something that Sarah later would call a tone of recognition. Older than human dialect, younger than myth. The team looked up. Dr. Stevens' hand hovered on the chart. "Did you," he started, but stopped, because it was the kind of sentence that unraveled professional decorum.
Sarah felt a blush spread across the back of her neck that had nothing to do with temperature. She was aware of the rosary under the band where her fingers rested, and of the way the being's hand, through the blanket, had tightened as if to anchor itself to human certainty. She learned its name that night, not in syllables the way humans spoke, but in a transference of concept. Zara. When the word landed in her mind, it came as a little map, who it was, where it had been, a compressed history that tasted like salt and processed air. Zara transmitted, "I am far from home. I came seeking help." The telepathic tag was necessary in Sarah's narration. She would later insist on the phrasing, to keep the line clear between what was said aloud and what filled the silence. The team called it alien in clinical language. Sarah called it hurt. Both names might be true. Over the following days, Zara slept in a cot beside the clinic's back office. People came like cautious moths, nurses with the polite curiosity of caretakers, a county official with a briefcase and too many questions, a journalist from the regional paper with a recorder she tried to hide. Sarah's life narrowed to a corridor of care, the rig, the clinic, a small wooden house where she kept a fern on the windowsill because her mother had once taught her to talk to plants like you would to someone who listened. Zara was not noiseless company. When she was awake, she hummed in the frequency of someone who had learned to keep herself small in foreign rooms. Her hands, when she lifted them, emitted a shimmer of light, small flares, like a very tiny aurora folded into her palms. The nurses were practical people, and they watched the shimmer like they watched an unusual wound, with the same clinical curiosity that asked for charts and for replication. They documented, they took notes with the mechanical devotion of those who build futures like scaffolding, one careful observation at a time. Sarah began to notice patterns. A drooping basil plant in the clinic's windowsill would, after Zara placed a cool palm over the pot for a minute, pry itself upright as if remembering how to stand. A jar of rice that had been left out for a month, stale and dull, when Zara cupped it in her elongated hands and hummed, sweetened. The grains swelled, glinting as if an invisible steam had passed through them. Sarah watched these small things and felt her skepticism crack, not as an argument, but as a seam. The first demonstration was the plant. It was mundanely scientific in origins. A packet of research funding that the clinic hoped would cover community health projects included a stipulation to beautify the reception area. The basil was drought-lean and brown at the tips. Someone had tried to revive it with too frequent watering and guilty neglect. At Zara's suggestion, she had a way of tilting her head that meant she favored practical testing. Sarah allowed her to try. The room filled with that curious scent Zara carried, something like ozone and orange peel, and when Zara set both hands around the pot, the leaves uncurled with a speed that made the fluorescent bulbs wink. There were witnesses: Nurse Lena, who had a daughter the same age as Sarah's niece, a county inspector who filed forms with a reverent hand, Dr. Stevens, who taped his jaw as if to hold an argument in. They recorded temperature, humidity, soil pH, and none of the numbers explained why the basal moved with the deliberateness of someone greeting the sun. Zara transmitted, "Living systems remember care. They will open to it." Sarah learned, in those early days, to bracket explanations. She logged everything, because that was what professionals did. She also found herself laughing in the shower as if to release a laugh she'd kept like a captive bird. Her hands remembered the sudden, clean motion of pre-hospital interventions. When she placed them over a patient, they moved with a clinical economy that belied the theater of the moment. Yet when she placed her hands over a plant or over the being's chest, it felt like the same thing, practiced in a different key. She began to keep a notebook, a thin legal pad that smelled like cheap paper and lemon oil. She wrote down what Zara hummed and the images that came with it, patterns of light, the memory of water held between stones, a phrase about harmonic tending that read like translation from a language tuned to vibration. Zara spoke in images as much as in words, and Sarah learned to translate them into English that would not collapse under the weight of metaphors. Zara transmitted, "You heal with your hands because you choose to be present. Presence is a vector." Presence, in Sarah's life, had always been an ethical posture. Show up, hold still, keep breathing. Now it had a strange, speculative spine. If presence could be trained, could it be measured? Could other paramedics learn what she had stumbled into? Or was this a personal accident, like how some storms hit the same place and others only once in a century? The plant demonstration rippled outward. A reporter published a cautious piece, "Local paramedic aids unusual patient," and the words made Sarah's stomach hollow. Letters came. One from a priest who asked if they might bring parishioners for a blessing, another from a nurse in Albuquerque who wanted to sit in on the next demonstration. Dr. Stevens insisted that everything be recorded, that independent verification be allowed, that ethics committees be contacted. He was right. The clinic placed a printed notice beside each demonstration table, small type, clinical and blunt. This narrative describes events as experienced by participants. These demonstrations are not medical advice. Consult qualified healthcare professionals for diagnosis and treatment. Sarah had insisted on the wording. The phrase comforted her in the way that procedural language sometimes does.
The second demonstration involved rice, an ordinary kitchen jar that became an unlikely proof when Zara set it in the center of a small group of skeptical ants. The community center where they staged this had a linoleum floor that hummed with the echoes of other people's meetings. AA, PTA, voter registration. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who lived 2 doors down and kept a roast chicken on Sundays like a ritual, attended with a trembling curiosity. She had a grandson with a stubborn cough that no medicine had cured. The cough had hollowed lines into her face. That was the human wrinkle beneath the spectacle. People brought their small human emergencies and leaned into what might be help. Zara's fingers hovered over the jar. The light that gathered at her palms was soft, like dusk settled into glass. She hummed a tone beneath her breath. Music without words, the kind that made the ceiling tiles vibrate like paper. The grains shifted. No one touched the jar. When the lid was opened, the rice smelled new, clean, like it had been rinsed and sun-dried. Mrs. Patterson laughed through tears and swallowed a small, sharp question about hunger and blessing. Someone filmed on a clunky camcorder. Someone else took notes. The community center's minister crossed himself, and then, to the surprise of many, he asked Zara a question about compassion that had nothing to do with hypothesis and everything to do with wonder. The demonstrations increased in ambition. The third involved Sarah herself. She had a scar on her knee, an old running injury that sometimes throbbed under lightning storms. It was a small thing, medically trivial, but it was Sarah's private test. She decided, on a night when the clinic lights had already gone down and only the emergency generator hummed, that she would try what she had seen Zara do. It felt wrong and right both. Wrong because protocols did not cover experimental healing.
Right, because some part of her had always wanted to learn how to still pain. She sat in a folding chair and removed her pant leg. The scar bent like a map. Zara placed her cool palms over the line and hummed a low, almost inaudible vibration that Sarah felt under the bones of her face. Her fingers anchored in the fabric of the chair. For a moment the pain rose like tide, and then, astonishingly, dissolved into a rolling warmth that moved like sunlight through water. Sarah's breath slowed. She thought of surgical knots and suture lines, of the measured economy of stitches. The heat was not burning. It was the feeling of an old fear being massaged into a new shape. She felt, in that moment, something else not her own, an impression of a figure standing on a hillside, hands extended. Zara transmitted an image. He held people so they could stand. The phrase landed like a seed. Sarah's mind, trained to hold protocol, seized on the evocative as if it were clinical. Who was the he? Zara's next transmission was a name that Sarah already knew from childhood prayers, quiet, threaded with reverence: Jesus. It is here that the narrative introduced its most delicate knot. Zara did not claim theological mastery, she claimed exposure. "I have met echoes," she transmitted. "You call him Jesus." The phrasing was careful and deferential. She did not assert doctrinal truth. She described a pattern she had encountered in the consciousness network she came from. A being whose presence, whether historical person, archetype, or consciousness pattern, had been a luminous template for tending. Zara transmitted, "The frequency of his compassion harmonizes the living." Sarah held the word Jesus like a bright coin between finger and thumb. It rattled with all the history she had carried: stained glass saints, a mother who smelled of violets and forgiveness, a parish altar lit 3 times before dawn. This was not a theological seminar. It was an intimate, trembling recognition that the template Zara described matched the silhouette of her own small human faith. The word's arrival made her knees weak in a way that had nothing to do with miracles and everything to do with family weather. The first wave of doubt came in the form of science. Even as Sarah felt the warmth in her knee, a line of questions tagged the sensation. Are we seeing placebo? Are these psychosomatic effects? How replicable is this? Dr. Stevens insisted on blind controls for demonstrations. Nurse Lina asked for lab-quality conditions. The county inspector brought forms. Sarah learned to listen to doubt as an instrument rather than a judge. Doubt sharpened protocols. It did not necessarily diminish wonder. The second wave of doubt cut deeper, into doctrine. Sarah's mother called late one night and asked directly, "Are you playing with idols?" The line went tinny with the weight of a generation's theological caution. Sarah tried to explain without betraying Zara, but every sentence felt like a compromise. There was the fear of being labeled a heretic, of betraying a childhood faith for something that used metaphors borrowed from other worlds. Zara sensed the friction and, in a transmission that was more like a hand on a narrow shoulder, said, "In my place, names carry patterns. The pattern you call Jesus is one of tending. Your people call him by that pattern. We recognize it, not to replace, but to reflect." The third wave arrived in the form of law. Who had jurisdiction over a phenomenon that blurred lines between biology and what some might call the spiritual? County officials asked about quarantine, about liability, about the risk of contagion. Lawyers appeared like clockwork when anything novel threatened to destabilize the public. Sarah received a summons to a meeting with legal counsel that smelled of coffee and practiced calm. The meeting was a ledger of contingencies, of whether they could be sued if a demonstration failed, of how to obtain informed consent in a context where consent included the unknown. The fourth wave of doubt was the most intimate: worthiness. If healing were an energetic practice, who deserved to receive it? Who could be trusted to hold the work? This question returned to Sarah in the small hours when she lay awake listening to the desert breathe. She had been a person who fixed people who were broken by accidents, by disease, by chance. Now she felt like a candidate at an invisible examination board. She worried. Did she have the moral authority to bring people into experiments with the human heart? Zara, sensing the inward struggle, transmitted a single phrase that felt like both reprimand and comfort. "You are chosen by your staying." It was a refrain that shifted the ethical calculus. Not that being chosen absolved policy concerns. It simply named a tenderness. She had stayed, she had shown up, and that had weight. The community had started to view Sarah as the bridge, the woman who could translate clinical observation into something that might be called, in the language of newspapers, miraculous. This new role frightened her more than the unknown. As the demonstrations continued, the staff took to documenting everything like archaeologists of the modern moment. They scheduled witnesses who did not believe. They filmed with redundant cameras. They had independent lab techs test samples pre- and post-demonstration. Patterns began to appear that could not be immediately dismissed as social contagion. The basil revived on average within minutes. The jar of rice manifested a measurable change in moisture content. Patients reported analgesia coincident with Zara's presence at rates that exceeded expected placebo windows, though not all cases responded. The data pool was messy but persisted. Sarah kept a ledger in that legal pad, not only of results but of the texture of each event. The smell of dust in the clinic when a new farmhand arrived with pain. The pattern of Zara's hums graded like notes on a scale. The way the light from Zara's palms shifted with humidity. Motifs began to braid into the narrative. Light as revelation. Hands as instruments of attention. Warmth as both symptom and therapy. The motifs held the story's threads together as Sarah negotiated her obligations to a profession and a community, and the strange invitation of something she could not wholly name. Word spread. Healers came, some with open minds, some with hard edges. A Baptist deacon came and watched in silence. Prayer beads nodded in his fist. A young physical therapist from Phoenix came and asked whether presence could be integrated into rehab protocols. Sarah found herself teaching a small, guarded group. How to hold presence. How to breathe into another's pain without swallowing it. How to document difference without making promises. Zara watched with the patient attentiveness of a teacher who had seen students fool themselves and blossom alike. Even as the circle widened, fear shadowed the edges. There were nights when someone left a threatening message scrawled on the clinic door. Keep God out of science. Another night, a local pastor gave a sermon about the danger of false prophets, and his words were quoted in a small-town column that tightened Sarah's chest like a strop. The community's response was not monolithic. It included wonder and fear, allegiance and suspicion. In it, Sarah learned the public ethics of a private miracle. That human hearts tend to respond in all the ways humans do: adoration, suspicion, appropriation, denial. In a public meeting at the community center, they staged a demonstration meant to be a clarifying moment. Dr. Stevens insisted on the conditions: independent observers, a sealed jar of rice, a potted plant with instruments in the soil. Mrs. Patterson sat in the second row, the lines around her mouth softened by hope. A local reporter threaded questions like a cord through the room. Sarah stood near Zara, hands folded, palms slightly warm from the fluorescent lights. Zara transmitted softly, "Observe without deciding." Her voice had become an ethic in that small auditorium. To look and not immediately frame, to witness without collapsing into immediate verdict. Sarah felt suddenly like someone standing at the edge of a pool, deciding whether to let a child go under and trust the water. The demonstration proceeded. Zara placed her hands over the plant and it brightened. She cupped the jar and the rice seemed to rearrange itself into a glinting, fresher array. The observers recorded. The reporters wrote. In the front row, Mrs. Patterson's shin shook. After the demonstration, she rose and stepped forward with a small brown envelope that had folded edges, like an offering. Inside were photographs of her grandson, Small, fever-lined, the kind of images that make anyone with a soft heart understand the currency of desperation. Sarah felt the room tilt toward a possible moral resolution. She had, at this point, enough measured observations to suggest something repeatable. But the moral scale weighed more than reproducibility. The question that hung in the air was simple. Could this practice be scaled without harm? Could it be taught without being exploited? Could it be held within an ethic that honored both faith tradition and scientific rigor? As the months unfurled, Sarah found herself pushed and pulled along lines she had not anticipated. Her training as a paramedic insisted on the sanctity of evidence and the primacy of consent. Her childhood faith needed to be honored, not overrun. Zara's transmissions continued, steady as a tune. Compassion is not religion, it is technique. It is not replacement for medicine, it is its complement. The phrasing was strategic, careful to avoid doctrinal imposition.
It allowed people like Sarah to hold both prayer and pulse, the rosary bead and the IV line, in the same hand. And yet the story was not without cost. Sarah negotiated interviews that sometimes felt like spooning water into a sieve. There were nights she lay awake wondering whether curiosity would become spectacle and whether she could bear the public's appetite for wonder. She thought often of her mother's hands, calloused, deft, folded in the habit of prayer, and felt both loyalty and trepidation. When she wrestled with the weight of stewardship, Zara transmitted a message that was less an instruction than a framing. You are a bridge. Bridges are not the point, they are means. They must be sturdy and respected. As the corridor of months narrowed into a year, the experiments grew. People came with small ailments and large ones. Some left with nothing changed. Others spoke of shifts so quiet and deep that they could not corroborate them clinically, but lived with the newness like a salvaged object. The community's sentiment fluctuated between exhilaration and exhaustion. The media loved the oddity, but reporters were not always kind. And then, when the world around them had learned to brace and wait for the next headline, the clarifying demonstration arrived, not in the clinic, but in the living room of a modest house beneath a stand of junipers. Mrs. Patterson's grandson, the one with the persistent cough that had eroded the boy's sleep and layered his days with fatigue, had been through a battery of tests that offered no clean answer. The family had reached the edge of hope, like people standing on a cliff together, arms twisted, waiting for someone to do the reckless thing. Sarah arrived with a small team, a nurse, a child life specialist, Dr. Stevens, and an independent observer from the university hospital. They set up with care. Instruments, baseline measurements, consent forms read aloud and signed. The house smelled of roast and wood smoke. The boy sat on the couch, fists clenched around a blanket, eyes red at the rims. Zara sat across from him and placed her hands on her knees. The light gathered, as it always did, but in that living room hush it shimmered like an honest thing. She transmitted nothing initially. She listened. That listening was, by now, a recognizable posture. She tuned to the boy's breath, to the family's rhythm, to the house's small architectural size. Sarah watched and felt something rare and honest, the suspension of her own agenda. Here was not a showcase, but an act of attention. The boy coughed once, twice, a sound like gravel in a gutter. Zara lifted her hands and made a motion as if smoothing air. The boy's chest rose and fell with a steadier cadence. Dr. Stevens read the baseline, and the room recorded. Time later would show small, measurable improvements in oxygen saturation that evening, and then again the next day.
But what made the demonstration decisive was not the single set of numbers. It was a cascade of independent confirmations. The university observer recorded improvement. The family reported a night of sleep the boy had not had in months. The community pastor, who had come to comfort the mother, later testified in a local meeting that he had seen a quiet peace restore itself to the home. That night, after the boy slept, the family sat with Sarah and said the word "thank you" until the edges of it softened.
Mrs. Patterson took Sarah's hands and pressed them like a benediction. Sarah felt, beneath the warmth, the weight of a new role. She was now a point of contact between skepticism and surrender, between hospital policy and living rooms where people kept rosaries in their teacups. The clarity that the boy's recovery provided was not absolute. There were still unanswered questions about mechanism and replication, but it shifted the community's scale. The legal threats softened. The county inspector who had once drawn lines in his notebook now sat quietly through a demonstration and left with an expression like a man who had seen a clean, inexplicable thing and did not want to diminish it by naming it. The physician community around Sarah began to come not as accusers but as curious colleagues. For Sarah, the result also resolved her personal knot. She sat in her small kitchen the night after the family celebration and turned over the rosary her mother had given her. She thought of the way Zara had used the word Jesus, not to rewrite doctrine, but to point at a recurring pattern of human tending that her species had recognized across worlds. The word mattered because it reminded her that human tradition and alien observation could both point toward compassion as practice. Still, Sarah knew that the narrative would not end with a single house. The work of responsibility would continue. Protocols to tighten, ethics to evaluate, training modules to write that would not promise miracles but would teach attention. She began drafting a small course for local practitioners: how to hold presence, the importance of consent, how to document results with humility and rigor. That was her compromise: to translate the wonder into methods that could survive scrutiny. Zara remained with them for a season, long enough for patterns to stabilize, short enough to keep the mystery intact. Before she left, she transmitted a fragment that felt like both consolation and call to action. You remember by practice what love makes visible. Teach hands to listen. Teach eyes to wait. The story of Sarah and Zara spread beyond Sakoro County, carried by cautious scientists, devout parishioners, and hungry reporters. Workshops were established that honored the clinical disclaimers and ethical boundaries they had painstakingly drawn. The community learned, imperfectly, to hold both questions and gratitude. When Sarah told the story later, years later, in a room filled with people who had come to learn how to pair clinical rigor with attentive presence, she would begin the way she had begun that first night, with an account of lights over the mesa, of hands that shimmered, of the rosary she had tucked into a stretcher. She would remind people that extraordinary claims in that life were always presented as in-world experiences, not as dogma to be wedded to. She would remind them that she never recommended replacing medical care with wonder. Every demonstration that helped someone had been accompanied by proper medical attention and informed consent. Her life had become, in small and meaningful ways, a bridge. She taught both symmetry and restraint, how to steady a pulse and how to steady a presence, how to record and how to hold a quiet room without immediate verdict. People argued about the metaphors and the meaning. Some called Zara a teacher from the stars, others a collective pattern of consciousness that matched the figure they called Jesus. Some accepted the language, others preferred clinical descriptions. Sarah learned to tolerate disagreement the way a surgeon tolerates movement on a patient's skin, because the human body of belief is complicated and often tender. In the years that followed, the motifs remained: light, hands, warmth, rice, and plant as small tokens of habit. Sarah's fern thrived on her windowsill. She watered it, and sometimes, just to remember the odd night when everything shifted, she would lay her hand on the pot and whisper the simple words Zara had given her: "Presence is a vector." There were costs: privacy lost, easier headlines that begged hyperbole, the occasional zealot who tried to claim the practice as a private right. But there were also recoveries that could not be explained away: a child sleeping through the night after a lifetime of cough, a neighbor who found the courage to leave an abusive situation, a clinic that learned to pair emergency medicine with a deeper ethic of attention. Sarah had saved lives before. Now she held steady a narrower miracle, a disciplined attentiveness that made space for vulnerable bodies to be seen. The alien she had rescued had known a name that resonated across human traditions. What Zara said about that name did not dismantle Sarah's faith. Instead, it reframed it as an ethic and a practice she could teach. The revelation that a consciousness from the stars recognized the pattern called Jesus did not demand conversion. It demanded curiosity and care. It asked that people attend to the ways love might be trained, and that the theological language remain respectfully in the hands of communities who carried it before an outsider echoed it back. When she told the story in public forums, Sarah always closed with the same caution. If this story moved you, carry it with humility. Do not confuse wonder with proof, and do not abandon doctors for anecdotes.
The boy with the cough, the basil that stood up like a small green soldier, the jar of rice that smelled clean. These were not proof of divinity, and they were not replacements for medicine. They were invitations to consider that compassion could be taught as technique, and that attention itself might alter living systems. Later, in a room thick with people who had come to learn, a young nurse asked Sarah plainly, "Do you believe Zara knew Jesus?" Sarah held the question like an ember. She answered with what she had learned. She knew a pattern we call by that name. Whether that means a person, a memory, or something else, people will answer that differently. For me, it was enough to see how that pattern loosened fear and made room for care. The story did what stories do. It shifted attention. It asked healers to practice presence, asked communities to pair ethic with curiosity, and asked individuals to admit that human hands might be trained to make small miracles less mysterious and more accountable. There were more complications to come: regulatory debates, scholarly papers that tried to model what they had seen, critics who accused Sarah of sensationalism. But on quiet nights she would sit with the rosary and the fern and remember an alien with silver skin and eyes like patient wells, who had whispered into her life a phrase that rearranged the geometry of what she thought possible: teach hands to listen. A small, surprising thing happened then. Children from neighboring towns began bringing jars of rice to the clinic, lined up like offerings. They wanted to watch. They wanted to learn how to be present. When Sarah taught them to hold space, she noticed something that no lab could measure: the way the children's fingers settled around a pot and the way their attention, like a muscle, strengthened. She could not predict the future. She could only keep showing up, keeping the ledger of observations and the weight of ethical restraint. The possibility that love could be a vector, trainable, repeatable in modest degrees, stayed with her like a promise both fragile and stubborn. And in the quiet moments, when the desert outside her window breathed and the fern shimmered in the light, she would think of the being who had known a name that had reverberated across centuries and species. What Zara had said did not shake her faith into splinters. It shook loose the complacencies that had kept wonder boxed. It invited her to a practice, to teach hands to listen, to teach eyes to wait, and to hold, with as much humility as she could muster, the strange intersection where science and careful compassion met. She taught the first formal session in the clinic's back room, under a ceiling fan that made a slow, dry wind over the folding chairs. The sign over the doorway was handwritten: "Practice in presence." Parents and nurses, a couple of school teachers, a retired midwife whose hands still remembered births, and the children, always the children. Sarah began, as she always did, with a small demonstration. She set a jar of rice on the table and asked everyone to stand around it and breathe. "Not to show you anything miraculous," she said, voice low, "but to show you how attention can change the shape of a moment." She asked them to press the palms of their hands lightly against the glass, not touching the rice, and to notice the temperature, the light, the sound of breathing. She asked them to imagine the rice as a body that needed only to be acknowledged to become less alone. At first, there was the self-conscious silence of people asked to be still. Then a chorus of tiny movements,
a child adjusting a chair, an elder closing her eyes, a nurse whose hands trembled less with practice. Sarah walked among them, showing how to lower the shoulders, how to let the gaze rest without searching. She taught them to ask permission with their eyes, to name the fear the way you might name a storm, so the person at its center knew it had been seen. After 10 minutes, she opened the jar. The rice smelled ordinary, warm paper and starch, and a basil sprout leaned from the rim where a tiny leaf had caught light. A woman in the back made a sound like surprise. A child clapped once and then buried her face in her mother's sleeve. No thunder, no revelation, only the steady, slow untying of a knot in the chest. "That is all it is," Sarah said, because she feared myth as much as she feared annihilation. Practice, not prayer, not a cure, a way to change the terms of care. Words spread as words do, crooked, generous, and careless in equal measure. A documentary filmmaker with a soft jaw came and filmed with permission, careful not to intrude. A medical student took notes and returned with a professor. An ethicist from the city wrote a thoughtful essay about attention and consent. An online forum made a meme about miracle rice, and a stranger from another continent sent a package of jars wrapped in newspaper. Offers arrived, some elegant and some crude. Invitations to speak at conferences, requests to license the method, a corporate training firm that wanted to sell mindful attention as a product for executives. The pressure was not sudden but cumulative, like water on stone. What worried Sarah most was not the acclaim or the misreading, but the potential to depersonalize what had been so stubbornly intimate. She had seen how markets could take a practice and turn it into an algorithmic checklist. She had seen how sanctuaries could become spectacles. In every interaction, she pressed the ethic she had learned from Zara and from the quiet of the fern: humility before the living, consent as practice, and the primacy of human need over novelty. She convened a small advisory group in the clinic kitchen: the midwife, the young nurse who had asked about Jesus, a professor of anthropology who loved careful footnotes, and a community organizer named Amaya who ran the after-school program. They argued kindly about syllabi and safeguards. The midwife insisted the practices remain free and local. The professor wanted precise language for study. Amaya reminded them they were in a neighborhood where people had been hurt by professionals who did not listen. The young nurse, whose name was Lila, said quietly that she worried most about how they'd teach newcomers to bear witness without offering false hope. "Teach them to stay small," Sarah said. "Teach them to ask. Teach them to leave the room cleaner than they found it." They drafted a curriculum that read like a delicate manifesto: consent, observation without intervening, the limits of attention, the integration of standard care, documentation for reproducibility, a clause ensuring community governance. They called it a practice rather than a therapy. They wrote case studies, not miracles but moments, where attention had reduced panic, where a held hand had steadied a diagnosis process enough for the patient to comply with treatment, where a grandmother's complaint had been heard and thus proved easier to treat. They emphasized partnership with licensed medicine and left space for clinical trials designed not to extract wonder, but to test whether training attention could measurably improve compliance, reduce anxiety, or speed recovery in minor ailments. The trials were messy and instructive. Some outcomes were prosaic: a faster intake interview, steadier vitals in anxious children, fewer missed medications. Some were stubbornly negative. Other clinics could not reproduce the subtle shifts behind the numbers. The scientists insisted on controls, on blinded assessments. The people in the neighborhood asked for accountability. Sarah learned to translate wonder into protocol, to inventory humility the way a clinician cataloged reflexes. Meanwhile, religious leaders who had listened to early tellings of her story began to call. Some offered blessing for what sounded like devotion. Others saw appropriation. A pastor asked the straightforward question she'd been asked before, about whether Zara knew Jesus.
Sarah gave the same answer, careful and kind. The pattern recognized a name. The pastor accepted that as enough to sit with. A scholar of comparative religion visited and politely catalogued the resonances between the pattern and various healing names across cultures. She left with notes and a soft, puzzled smile. The most painful calls were private. A mother whose child had regressed after parental separation. A veteran who had nightmares. A man with Parkinsonian tremors asking whether attention could still his hand. Sarah had to say no sometimes, and sometimes yes in modest increments. She learned to carry the sorrow of cannot with the intimacy of cannot yet. Through it all, Zara remained an improbable lodestar.
The alien did not reappear in any dramatic return. Twice there were dreams, strange, radiant echoes where Sarah walked through tall, thin canyons of sound, but no further instruction fell from silver skin. There was, however, a letter, translucent and folded in a way that made her think of paper cranes, left at the clinic doorstep with no sender. Inside were 2 simple lines, in a handwriting that slanted like breath. Practice with tenderness. Remember the smallness of listening. Sarah kept that sheet under her rosary for months. She found herself repeating, "Teach hands to listen," not as a slogan, but as a daily liturgy. She watched trainees stumble and then find a steadiness, heard community members remark on being held in ways that had been rare in their lives. She watched the children come back, older now, hands less fidgety, and teach newcomers how to circle a jar of rice. The children's attention became its own pedagogy. They had no use for commodified wonder. They delighted in the tiny shifts and were not given to hyperbole. But there was also friction. A journalist wrote a long piece that put Sarah at the center of a story about a new attention industry. She read it on a train and felt her throat tighten at a line that suggested a method could replace medicine. A pharmaceutical lobbyist visited the university campus and smiled in a way that suggested a plan to monetize the method as part of a suite of patient engagement tools. A tech company offered to build a wearable that would measure attention and give users feedback in an app. Each of these overtures required a refusal, a careful explanation, or the deployment of the promises they had written into the curriculum: community governance, non-commercialization, integrity to consent. Refusal had costs. Grants were withheld. A foundation withdrew funding when Sarah's clause forbidding monetization troubled its investors. A clinic in a neighboring city tried to trademark the practice's name and was slapped down by a community letter from Amaya and the midwife. These fights taught Sarah how easily virtue could be misread as property. She entered public debates she had not sought, speaking about the dignity of unmarketized care and the hazards of turning attention into a metric. And yet, in the small victories, the work held a shape. A local school invited Sarah to help train teachers in classroom presence. Leela began to teach nurses in training, and where she went, she carried Sarah's careful speech. The professor published a piece that found modest but reproducible reductions in patient anxiety when clinicians practiced the protocol. It was not a miracle paper, but it lent a hand to those who needed academic backing. The midwife began hosting neighborhood evenings where people told stories about being held as they had never been before. Those evenings created a thin, resilient network of reciprocity. One winter evening, a boy named Tomas came into the clinic with a fever that had not abated. He was small for his age, hair matted at the temple, eyes bright with fever. His mother sat in the chair as if made of salt and guilt. The clinic's thermometer hummed. The nurse recorded vitals. Sarah sat beside Tomas and listened. She did not close her eyes. She simply let her attention be a presence, patient and non-demanding. She asked the mother about the cough, the sleeping patterns, the medications they had tried. She asked permission to put a cool cloth on Tomas's forehead. She told him softly that she would stay until his breathing felt less like a rope pulled tight. No jar of rice. No basil, just a child and a woman and the clinical measures that matter. They administered fluids and antipyretics according to protocol.
Between interventions, Sarah taught the mother how to hold her child's hand so the child's breath might find a rhythm. The fever broke in the night. Tomas slept deeper than he'd had in weeks. The mother wept softly and said, "I thought I had to be brave alone." Those were the moments Sarah had hoped for. Attention that did not substitute for medicine, but shaped the human substrate that made medicine effective. She began to see the strange reciprocal economy of it all. The clinic became a place where science met a pedagogy of presence, practiced in the small transactions of skin and gaze and waiting. At the end of the season, the children's jars returned as a ritual. They lined the windowsill, tiny altars of participation, each jar with a note: for easing my brother's fear, for remembering to sit with my neighbor, for my abuela's bad nights. The notes were not testimonials pressed into claims, but promises to a practice. Sarah read them all and kept a stack in a drawer. Once, when the clinic was quiet and the desert moon made the fern silver, she found herself adding a note of her own, for the patience to refuse the easy narrative, for the courage to keep showing up. There were still debates, public, private, and sometimes bitter, about what the practice could be and who spoke for it. Sarah learned to answer the questions with the slow patience she taught, to name limits, to insist on consent, to refuse extraction. She learned to celebrate small, verifiable changes without letting those changes flatten the mystery that had first guided her. On a morning when a storm rolled over the desert and dust found the window panes like memory, a letter arrived from a hospital far away asking for training. It was a respectful letter, full of questions and clinical humility. Sarah read it twice, and then brought it to the advisory group. They talked for hours about scale and fidelity, about whether the practice could survive being taught beyond the small, intimate circle. They worried that as the technique traveled, its ethics might fray. On a morning when a storm rolled over the desert and dust found the window panes like memory, a letter arrived from a hospital far away asking for training. It was a respectful letter, full of questions and clinical humility. Sarah read it twice, and then brought it to the advisory group. They talked for hours about scale and fidelity, about whether the practice could survive being taught beyond the small, intimate circle. They worried that as the technique traveled, its ethics might fray. In the end, they took a middle path, a modest pilot with careful oversight, a covenant that any new site would be co-led by local community members, and the insistence that the curriculum remain free and governed by those who had lived the work rather than those who sought to package it. Amaya insisted on a clause guaranteeing community audits. Leela wanted an ethics mentor assigned to each new site. They added language in plain terms so families could understand what they were consenting to. The pilot began in spring. Sarah traveled with 2 small suitcases and a copy of the curriculum that looked less like a manual and more like a living document. She taught the first cohort in a bright hall that smelled of antiseptic and lemon, and she watched as a new group of hands learned to be present. Some left unchanged, some discovered a steadiness they carried home. The scale was slow. The heart of it, paradoxically, demanded slowness. On the eve of her departure, she sat on the hospital roof and looked at the stars. The desert had taught her how smallness could be a virtue, and how careful practice could sustain generosity without consuming it. She thought of Zara, of silver skin and patient wells, and of the way a phrase from another intelligence had rearranged the geometry of her life. She thought of how faith had been unspooled from dogma into discipline, and how a name long held by human tongues had become a pattern of attention that could be taught and tested. She folded her hands in her lap, fingers tracing the old rhythm of the rosary she still carried. There was more to learn, more to resist, and more to hold with the same stubborn humility. The work would not resolve itself in a single triumph. It would live in the patient accumulation of small, careful acts. Before she left, Leela gave her a jar of rice with a single basil leaf pressed against the glass. On the note tied to it was one sentence: "Teach hands to listen, and teach them to keep silent when silence is needed." Sarah smiled and tucked the jar into her case as if packing a compass. She walked back into the clinic to say goodbye. The fern trembled in the window. Children waved.
Behind them, in the soft clatter of daily life, the practice continued. Unglamorous, stubborn, and marginally miraculous. Not because it promised epiphanies, but because it taught people to be present for each other in ways that made medicine work better and life a little less solitary. She left with that smallness pricked like a map against her ribs. There were mountains ahead, and flat deserts, and rooms she had never entered. But the phrase moved with her like ballast. Teach hands to listen.